In order for this wound to heal, it undergoes 4 distinct but overlapping stages of wound healing: homeostasis, inflammatory phase, proliferation phase, and remodeling. Each of these phases contains significant psychological lessons that could guide our emotional recovery and to overcome psychological wounds and trauma. In this video, let's explore the first phase of wound healing and see 3 significant psychological lessons. The first phase of wound healing, homeostasis, involves stabilization and damage control. What the body is trying to do in this instance is to ensure that there is no further blood loss from this wound. It does this biologically by activating specialized cells, platelet, and some release of specialized chemicals called the clotting factors. In essence, all that is happening here is that the platelet cells forms like a thin layer to ensure that this wound doesn't bleed further. This is a significant psychological lesson and tells us that the first thing after a psychological wound is to seek out for stability and damage control. Practically, this will involve moving away from the source of the injury or to a place of safety. Imagine every time this wound tries to stop bleeding and are reintroducing it to a source of injury and it keeps on bleeding. Soon after, it just keeps on bleeding, and that could lead to systemic complication like anemia because of just bleeding continuously. And so would your psychological wound lead to a more systemic problem if you can't achieve safety, if you can't get away from the psychological source of this injury. Some of our psychological wounds haven't healed. Why? Because we haven't achieved that homeostasis. Every time the wound stops bleeding, we re-expose ourselves again to the source or the same environment that caused the injury in the first place. And so it might involve you getting away from the abuser. It might involve you creating space from the source of the injury, so at least go allow the bleeding to stop, allow for stability. It is important to stress here that stabilization and stability after a psychological injury has to be individualized, because the source of the psychological wound could also be the source of the basic needs of the person who is being abused. But I understand this complexity, but you have to seek stability, otherwise that psychological wound won't heal because it keeps bleeding. But here's a catch. Biologically, some things could impede on this phase of wound healing. If I have like a low platelet count, it means that the cell that is needed to achieve that stabilization is not adequate in my system. And what will happen is that this wound just keeps bleeding. And in order for me to solve that problem, I would need to get transfusion of the platelet concentrate, what I'm lacking. And so do we need external help sometimes when you're dealing with psychological wounds. And so it is okay for you to reach out for help, to get therapy, because you just don't have the right amount of what it takes to handle this psychological wound. The third lesson is that sometimes, even though you have the right amount of the platelet count and the required endogenous substances, but you notice that after 1 week, 2 weeks, this wound still keeps bleeding. Why? Because you're taking in some medication, like anticoagulating medication, that has impeded on this phase of wound healing. That also happens psychologically. Even though you've been to therapy, even though you've gotten some psychological skills and emotional skills, you still realize that this psychological wound still feels fresh because you've ingested something that is impeding on your wound healing. And this could be some informations, news, music, keeping some toxic relationship. What this phase of wound healing would inform us is that it is so important for us to get help if you notice that the psychological wound still feels fresh after months, years. It is important for us to take stock of what we are still ingesting psychologically, the friends we are keeping, the relationship that we are still keeping, because that could be some substances that is impeding your wound from healing.